So I'm here to talk today mostly about kind of big picture, 10,000-foot view about kind of our policy responses to sexual offending kind of in general. But I think before I do that, I want to just kind of contextualize this and I think really kind of pick up on some of Catherine's remarks about the differences between youth and adults who have sexually offended. Um, we had an incident in my town just, about 2 weeks ago. A young man who is well known to within our community, 21 years old, was arrested for allegedly inappropriately touching some young children at a daycare center. It turns out that he'd been working at the YMCA for several years, the local Y where my daughter also works. A lot of the kids knew him, a lot of the parents knew him. He's 21 years old. He's heading into the adult criminal justice system. According to news reports, he indicated that he began having these feelings for kids when he was about 16 or 17 years old. He didn't know where to look, and here we go, okay? He's not a juvenile. He's not being adjudicated. He's being prosecuted in criminal court, and he's heading into kind of a scenario that I'm going to describe here, which is around our policies around sexual offending. So I think that when we talk about this juvenile-adult distinction, I think we need to kind of keep cases like this in mind because particularly in light of some of the stuff that we're going to be hearing about today about prevention, it's really important that we keep all of this in context. The debate, particularly among, a lot of the debate we've had around sexual offender policy generally has been somewhat acrimonious at times. On one side, we have a group that is perceived by the other as being reactive, being overly punitive, being resistant to integrating evidence. We tend to talk about the fact that our policies, our public policies, are kind of knee-jerk reactions to these very extreme events, and I'm going to get into some of that. On the other side, those who are on the other side are often viewed as being soft on offenders and not quite in tune with reality. And this is a lot of the discourse that's kind of permeated our public policy discussion around sexual offending. And I want us to try to move a little bit beyond that. In the research realm, we've had a similar kind of set of narratives about how research is used and how evidence is used in the context of the formulation of public policy. Okay. Again, the narrative has been that very often policymakers, legislators are not terribly sensitive to the evidence that's out there. They're not listening. And then on the other side of the equation, we hear that maybe our research is not quite as in tune with reality and with the pragmatic realities that practitioners, particularly law enforcement practitioners, need to deal with on a daily basis. And what I want us to try to do today, and this is really going to be my punchline at the end of the talk, is to try to move beyond this. And I'm going to try to talk about ways that we can do that. Now, before I get into that. We might just begin by thinking about policy responses to sexual violence through this kind of bilateral framework. And again, this reflects some of the dichotomies that I just presented. We have what I call our criminal justice-based responses, and we have what we're going to call our public health and human service-based responses, which we're going to spend a lot of time today hearing from speakers that are going to be focusing on this one. I'm going to, as someone who's been involved in the justice system, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about our criminal justice-based policies and what they look like. And before I do that, though, I think we'll just take a second to take a look at what distinguishes these two approaches. The first is that when we're talking about criminal justice-based policies, they tend to be mostly driven by statute. Okay? It's legislation that is passed. They have to be implemented down there. And we're talking mostly about criminal codes. In some cases, we have civil processes. I'll get into those in a minute. The public health and human services sector tends to be a little bit more kind of ground up. The innovations and the kinds of policies that we see, hopefully, and this is not always the case, but are mostly driven by kind of emerging programs, emerging practices, what works. And I will argue that it's a sector that is probably a bit more receptive and conducive to the implementation of evidence-based practice. When we talk in terms of the realm of prevention, mostly when we're talking about criminal justice responses, we're talking about what we call tertiary prevention. Okay, it's where basically something has happened, we're trying to respond and intervene, and the public health approach obviously comes at things from a very different angle, and the emphasis is mostly, ideally, and this is what we're going to talk about a lot today, is primary and secondary. And then we obviously are working in different kinds of activity domains. You'll be hearing from a number of speakers today talking about primary prevention initiatives. What I'm going to do is talk about these justice-based activity domains. So we can kind of put our justice-based policies of sexual violence into two main categories. The first is investigation, enforcement, and interdiction. And the second is sentencing and management of perpetrators. I'm going to spend most of my time on the latter, but I just want to talk about a couple of places where government policy has played a very active role in the investigation and enforcement, and kind of how this can kind of feed into a broader framework. First one is with relation to human trafficking. And there's been a lot of discussion about it today. Ryan's actually going to be following me and talking about this in significantly more detail. But this is, in fact, one of the earliest, and probably the earliest, domain where federal law enforcement has been involved in really pretty much anything. Okay? The FBI was established in 1910, the same year that the Mann Act, also known as the White Slavery Act of 1910, was passed. And in fact, the FBI, up until Prohibition, and J. Edgar Hoover enters the scene to try to bust up the organized crime, it pretty much was all the FBI had to do. Okay, its major role was the enforcement of this act that effectively was put in place to disrupt what was perceived as human trafficking networks. And there's a whole perverse history to the Mann Act that Ryan will get into, having to do with kind of the racial dynamics particularly. But the thing is, this is not something new. Okay, it's something that the federal government's been involved with for many years. Beginning in the early 2000s, we saw a sequence of legislation that began to put additional federal focus on this, and the states have kind of followed suit. Okay, so again, this is something that I think really began at the federal level, and states over the years have been passing very significant state laws combating human trafficking, and a lot of this has happened in very recent years. Second major domain where we see, again, what we would consider to be, some form of prevention of the exploitation of children is in the realm of child pornography and internet-based sexual exploitation of kids. The child pornography laws date back to the 1970s, and over the years, we've seen a sequence of federal activity where there's been increasing federal focus. I'm going to show you some data in a little while about the federal prison system and what's been going on there. But the prosecution and the disruption of child pornography networks has become a major initiative. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I think we're mostly concerned about here, which is about the role of government and policies related to the sentencing and management of known perpetrators of sexual violence. And in contrast with these first couple of examples that I gave you, which really, I think, emanated a lot from federal action, largely because they involved interstate, interjurisdictional issues, state-level laws and policies around the management of sex offenders was traditionally a state-level matter. Okay? Back in the 1930s, states began passing laws known as sexual psychopath laws, where individuals who are deemed to be at risk of perpetrating sexual offenses were committed to psychiatric institutions. Now, of course, at that time, there was definitions of sexual deviance were very different. In the 1950s, we saw homosexuals were routinely rounded up and placed in psychiatric facilities simply by the basis of the sexual orientation. We also began in the 1940s seeing sex offender registries that we think about as a current thing. They actually are quite old. They began cropping up in the 1940s in California and other places. And the whole idea of having individuals who were sexually deviant registering with law enforcement and law enforcement can keep tabs on them. These laws were in place well before the current era. We saw a major shift, though, in our current policy, and I think that kind of ground zero of our current policy, the justice-based policy approaches to sexual offending, was the passage of the Washington Community Protection Act in 1990. And the act really consisted of kind of three major prongs that we've seen continue throughout the current era. The first is kind of a retooling of these original sexual psychopath laws to what we call sexual predator civil commitment laws. Secondly, sentencing reforms, which I'll get into in a minute. And the third, this is the nation's first community notification law. We also saw a couple of other laws kind of cropping up over the ensuing several years. Two of the major features were Megan's Law, passed in New Jersey in 1994, and the Jessica Lumsford Act in Florida in 2005. And I'll talk about those in a minute. When we take a step back and we look at these policies that really began in the 1990s, and we've seen, we're now about a quarter century in, we can kind of put them into two major kind of buckets. The first are what we call institutional strategies, and the second are community-based. Institutional strategies basically means locking people up, incapacitating them so that they can't harm anybody. Okay? As I mentioned, Washington passed the nation's first sexual predator civil commitment law in 1990. 21 states have followed suit, and the federal government followed suit in 2006. And the basic idea here is this is actually not the use of the criminal justice system. It's the use of the public mental health system to hold offenders after they have been released from custody. And the whole idea was that these were individuals who somehow slipped through the cracks, who needed to be held, and it's post-release confinement for these folks. There are a number of key issues and problems with this. One of them, the most critical one, after 25 years of experience with these laws, is that it's very easy to get people in. It's not very easy to get them out. And so what we've seen is growing populations. We have about 3,000 or 4,000 people who are confined to psychiatric facilities by the basis of sexual dangerousness in this country right now. We're beginning to see things kind of tearing apart at the seams a little bit. A number of states have been looking at the growing costs. It's much more expensive to keep somebody in a psychiatric facility and provide them with treatment. It's about $100,000 a year versus $20,000 a year to put them behind bars, or probably less to manage them in the community. And there's also been some significant legal challenges, that, particularly one faced by Minnesota right now, and we think that this is kind of going to be coming to a head again very soon. So I think in the end, this is not a sustainable approach, but that's talk for another day. Second way to obviously lock people, the second thing is obviously to lock people up. And we've seen some significant trends in sentencing for sexual offenders over the last 20 years. And some of these have crosswalked with broader sentencing trends that we've seen for violent offenders in general, but I'm going to show you in a few minutes how those who committed sexual offenses are somehow really kind of disproportionately affected. Longer mandatory sentences and sentencing guidelines have been put in place. We've seen a number of sentencing reforms. There's these laws called truth in sentencing, and the whole idea is that if someone gets convicted to 10 years, they should be serving 10 years or close to it. Okay, part and parcel to that has been a reduction in the ability for people to get parole. In the old days, it used to be people would go in front of a parole board, and that would make a decision about whether they were due to be released. But what's happened is through legislation, the legislatures have very gradually chipped away at the discretion that judges, prosecutors, and parole boards have, and so a lot of this stuff is now codified into law. As a result, we've seen that those who have committed sexual offenses are staying longer in prisons. Sorry, this is kind of so low. But in 1993, the median month served for those released in 1993 was 44 months. It grew to 75 months in 2009. Similar kind of pattern for other sexual assault, and these rates are actually outpacing those of other types of offenders. Now, as a result of these longer stays, obviously, more people going in, staying longer. We've seen sexual offenders growing as a proportion of the prison population by about 50% over the last 20 years. Okay, from about 8% in 1991 to about 12% in 2011. So here's a quick snapshot of where people are sitting. The one group that's missing here are jail inmates. There's no real reliable estimate about exactly how many people are in local jails that fall into this. There are probably about 800,000 people in local jails in the country right now. ballpark, say 10%. So we're probably talking about another 70 or 80,000 that are in local jails. And so we have roughly half of those committed sexual offenses sitting behind bars or in some kind of institutional capacity. And we have another half that are under probation or parole supervision. Okay? And so that's kind of part of the overall pie. So you have 200,000 kind of in each bucket, about 400,000 people who are under criminal justice supervision. But that's not it, obviously, right? We have certainly our parole and probation group, which is about 200,000. A certain subset of that group have fallen under a series of initiatives that have mandated mandatory lifetime supervision, global position satellite or electronic monitoring, intensive supervision. And so there's a subset of those, and this is largely a byproduct of these laws that have been passed in many states called Jessica's laws. It's kind of one piece of it. But beyond that, in the blue circle, we have a whole other group that are not under any form of criminal justice supervision, technically, at least on the correctional side, but are being monitored by law enforcement. And these are the folks who are on our nation's sex offender registries. Okay? In this realm, those who committed sexual offenses are kind of a unique group. Okay? There's really no other categorical group of offenders that once they have served their time in prison and done their time under formal supervision are also still being monitored. And so what we've had is kind of an interesting mission creep between what is traditionally done by parole and probation agencies and now what's being done by law enforcement, because most of those folks on the registries are being monitored by law enforcement agencies or their local police. The registration population is then served as a conduit for a whole series of other laws that have been passed that have placed statutory restrictions on what those who are convicted of sexual offenses can and can't do. Okay? The most prominent being where they can and can't live, but there are also laws around employment. There are other place-based restrictions, things like you can't go into libraries or hang out in your playgrounds. And there has been a move over recent years to restrict the internet activities and social media use. A lot of those have been struck down in the courts, but that's still kind of out to, the jury's still out on that one right now. So the registration has kind of become the hub for a lot of our contemporary sex offender policies. A lot of this, again, comes back to the Washington Community Protection Act. That was the first community notification law. In 1994, we had two major pieces of legislation that were passed. One of them was Megan's Law in New Jersey. And the second, which is really critical here, is that the federal government got into the act. And it passed a law called the Wetterling Crimes Against Children Act that effectively required that states set up sex offender registries. And over the years, in the wake of the Wetterling Act, we saw the registration systems in the U.S. grow significantly. The blue bar are the registration systems, and the orange bars, mostly that kind of were driven by the federal passage of a federal version of Megan's Law, indicate that by the end of the 1990s, all 50 states had registration and notification systems in place. And we've seen a steady progress of federal legislation, amending the Wetterling Act, and then in 2006, the passage of a law called the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act that really set forth a whole brand new set of standards for sex offender registration notification. So we've seen a growing federal role in a lot of this. So there's been a lot of activity as an outgrowth of the federal legislation. Between 2008 and 2013, about 312 pieces of state legislation were passed that somehow amended the registries. 17 states have today been deemed to be in compliance with the federal law. 33 have not, including 3 of the largest, New York, Texas, and California, which alone comprise about a third of the nation's sex offender registrants. That's not in compliance, but still all these states have been slowly amending their sex offender registration systems. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children puts out regular numbers about the number on the registries. They put the number about 819,000. Given the fact that a lot of these are double counted or incarcerated, we probably think there's about 500,000 individuals who are living in the community who are under this. Now, are these policies good policies or bad policies? Well, this is kind of a matter of perspective, right? We've spent a lot of time trying, and this is a whole other talk, but we spent a lot of time trying to evaluate from an empirical standpoint, whether these policies are working. And I think the jury's still out. Okay, there's a lot of evidence for and against, but we have to realize that the evidence is kind of just one part of the picture. Okay, we have these things like the concept of justice. Okay, and who that justice is for is a really critical piece. And so this question about whether we're on the right path or not is something that we're going to need to debate and discuss. So where are we heading? So far I've painted a picture where we're talking about longer sentences, more monitoring and supervision than any other population. Okay, and I think we can kind of put all of that into what we call a relatively reactive kind of punitive bucket. But that's not the whole picture. Before I just want to kind of have us kind of like stew on this a little for a second. This is data from a national survey that we did of 1,000 nationally representative sample of 1,000 U.S. adults last April, and we asked them about their beliefs about sex crimes in the United States. And 6% of them thought that sex crimes were less common today than they were 20 years ago, and 54%, more than half, thought that they were more common, and then this other large group thought that they're the same. Okay, what's the answer here? Okay. Pretty much any data that you look at, and David Finkelhor has done a lot of work around this, okay, by almost any indication, we've seen a very significant decline over the last 20 years. So that 6% kind of got it right, okay? But I want us to focus less on who's got it right and kind of what this is telling us, okay? Well, one thing it could be telling us is that, well, this explains why people are in support of such kind of punitive policies. But it also presents us with a great opportunity. Okay, because it's an opportunity to begin discussing this. I actually believe that part of this has to do with the fact that people are more attuned to child sexual abuse, particularly as an issue. Okay, and I think we have things like the Sandusky case and the clergy sex abuse scandal and other things that have made people, I think, take a much broader, rounded view of this issue than just these extreme cases that have driven the federal legislation to date. So I actually think we're heading into a place where the environment is really ripe for some significant change. And we've seen this happening, okay? At the state level policy, we're seeing new kinds of laws, okay? It's not just about kind of heaping restrictions on known sex offenders, just looking at things like, the needs of victims in human trafficking, okay? We've seen an expansion of these laws called Aaron's laws that are mandating sexual abuse prevention education in the schools, okay? We've seen statute of limitations reform. We've seen the growth of sex offender management policy boards that really are charged specifically with kind of integrating the evidence and effectively providing legislators with political cover so that they can make these difficult decisions that need to be made. At the federal level, we've seen the SMART office and Department of Justice taking on some really, I think really promising places, okay? This is an office that was set up ostensibly to operate and implement the Adam Walsh Act, but at the same time, they've kind of taken this broader view, and I think Scott Mattson was here last year at this conference talking about the Sex Offender Management and Policy Initiative. But this is really a phenomenal initiative that is really beginning to talk about how evidence can be integrated more effectively into practice. And as a result of that, in addition to the OGADP initiatives that Catherine talked about, the Department of Justice has been investing in really pushing our practice forward, okay, and moving more towards evidence-based initiatives. These are just some examples of things that are going on at DOJ. If you go to the National Sex Offender Public Registration Portal, okay, this is the place where citizens go to look for sex offenders, okay? Well, there's a nice tab on there that's pretty prominently featured on education and prevention, okay? So I think we're seeing that there are opportunities here, okay, and that there is an embracing of the fact that this is a broader issue than just setting up these registries and monitoring offenders. So when we look at this bilateral framework, I think it has limited utility in the end, okay, because what we really need to be doing is thinking about how all these elements can be integrated into a cohesive whole, okay? The fact that we always are going to be having justice responses that are kind of reinforcing our values and keeping kids safe. And those things can really work well in tandem with all these other kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today. So with that, I thank you for your time.